Money. A simple word, only 5 letters long, but behind it lies a force that shapes nearly every human life. Wars have been fought over it. Families have been torn apart because of it, and entire civilizations have risen and collapsed under its weight. Yet, for all its influence, money is not what it appears to be. We think of it as numbers on a screen, coins in our pocket, or paper bills in our wallet. But the truth is, money is a mirror. It reflects back our hopes, our fears, our desires, and our mistakes. Morgan Housel, in his book The Psychology of Money, makes a bold but simple claim. Doing well with money isn't about how smart you are. It's not about knowing the formulas or memorizing the theories. It's about how you behave. And behavior, as we all know, is messy. It's emotional. It's inconsistent. It's sometimes brilliant and sometimes self-destructive. This is why the richest person in the room is not always the smartest, and the smartest person is not always the richest. Intelligence helps, of course, but without the right temperament, without the ability to control greed, fear, and impatience, intelligence can quickly become useless. What Housel offers is not a textbook. It's not a manual filled with equations. It's a collection of 19 timeless lessons that reveal how psychology shapes our financial lives. Each lesson is a lens, giving us a new way to see not just money, but ourselves. And so, as we embark on this journey, I want you to imagine this not as a lecture, but as a story. Imagine we're sitting together, perhaps in a quiet cafe or on a park bench in the early evening. The world moves around us, cars pass by, people go about their lives, but here we are, talking about the invisible force that affects every one of them: money. I will tell you stories, some from history, some from everyday life, some from my own reflections. And with each story, we'll uncover one of the 19 lessons. Sometimes these lessons will feel obvious, almost too simple. But as with many truths in life, simplicity hides depth. What's obvious in words is often difficult in practice. So let us begin where Housel begins, with the most fundamental idea of all, the recognition that no one is crazy. Welcome to MindSpark, where great books meet powerful ideas. Lesson 1. No one's crazy. Think about the last time you judged someone's financial choices. Maybe you rolled your eyes when a friend bought the newest phone on credit even though they were already struggling to pay rent. Maybe you shook your head when a colleague pulled all their money out of the stock market during a downturn, only to miss out when it recovered. Or maybe you wondered how your cousin could possibly think that buying lottery tickets every week was a plan for getting rich. It's easy to dismiss those decisions as foolish, irrational, or crazy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. From their point of view, those choices made sense. We all see the world through the lens of our own experiences. A child who grew up during the Great Depression might see banks as dangerous and prefer to stash cash under the mattress. A millennial who entered the workforce during the 2008 financial crisis might carry a permanent fear of investing. Someone who grew up in the booming 1990s might see the stock market as a natural engine of wealth and dive in with confidence. Same world, same financial tools, but completely different behaviors. When you realize this, you begin to see that no one is truly crazy about money. They are simply responding to the world they know. Lesson 2. Luck and risk. Picture 2 young men standing side by side in the late 1960s. Both are bright, ambitious, fascinated by the strange new world of computers. One of them is Bill Gates, who will go on to become one of the richest men in history. The other is Kent Evans, Gates's close friend and intellectual equal. Together they dream about the future, sketching out ideas that could change the world. But history remembers only one of them. Gates had the extraordinary good fortune of attending Lakeside School in Seattle, one of the rare high schools in the entire country with a computer terminal at that time. We take it for granted now, but back then, computers were gigantic, expensive machines, locked away in universities or corporations. For a teenager in the late 1960s to have access to one was almost unheard of. Gates didn't just have talent. He had opportunity, a chance created by luck and circumstance. Kent Evans, on the other hand, was tragically killed in a mountaineering accident before adulthood. All his brilliance, his potential, his dreams vanished in an instant. He never had the chance to leave his mark on the world. Same starting line, similar intelligence, similar ambition. But luck smiled on one and risk struck the other. This story reveals a sobering truth. Success and failure are never just about skill. They are also about luck and risk, forces beyond our control that can lift us up or tear us down. When I first read this, I felt a sting of recognition. We live in a culture that worships success stories. We study the habits of billionaires, dissect their routines, and tell ourselves, if I just work as hard as they did, I'll get there too. But how often do we study the stories of those who worked just as hard, were just as smart, but didn't make it? Survivorship bias hides them from view. We see the winners, not the countless losers. I once knew a man who built a promising company in the 1990s. He worked tirelessly, pouring his energy into it, and for a while, it grew. But then the dot-com bubble burst. The market collapsed, investors vanished, and his company went under. He wasn't less talented than the entrepreneurs who survived. He wasn't lazier or less ambitious. He was simply on the wrong side of timing. Risk found him, and luck did not. This doesn't mean effort is meaningless. Far from it. But it does mean we should hold our success with humility. When we achieve something great, we should be grateful not only for our hard work, but for the circumstances that allowed it. And when others fail, we should remember that sometimes failure has less to do with character and more to do with chance. Think about the stock market. Two investors can make the same decision, say, buying into a particular company. For one, the timing is lucky, the stock soars, and they look like a genius. For the other, the timing is unlucky, the stock crashes, and they look like a fool. Same decision, different outcomes. Luck and risk are invisible partners in every financial move we make. This is why judging others is dangerous. It's easy to look at someone who went bankrupt and say, they must have been reckless. Sometimes they were, but sometimes they simply encountered risks that overwhelmed them. Likewise, it's easy to idolize someone who got rich and say, they must be brilliant. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they were just in the right place at the right time. The challenge, of course, is that luck and risk are almost impossible to measure. We can't assign percentages to them. We can't predict when they'll strike. They operate in the shadows, which makes it tempting to ignore them. But ignoring them is like ignoring gravity. They are real, whether we see them or not. I remember a conversation I had with a colleague who loved to analyze successful entrepreneurs. He was fascinated by Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. He tried to mimic their work habits, their leadership styles, even their diets. But one day I asked him, what about the people who did all those things and still failed? What about the brilliant founders whose companies disappeared without a trace? He paused, and for the first time, admitted he hadn't thought about that. He was studying only the winners. And studying only the winners creates a distorted picture, because you forget how much luck and risk play in the outcome. Housel makes a powerful point. When things go right, we should never assume it was all our doing. And when things go wrong, we should never assume it was all our fault. The truth is somewhere in between. I think of my own life. There were times I worked hard but failed, because circumstances beyond my control derailed my plans. And there were times I succeeded, but deep down I knew luck had played a hand. A chance meeting, a sudden opportunity, a stroke of timing. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the value of effort. It makes me more compassionate, more humble, more aware that none of us truly stand alone. So what's the takeaway? It's not to give up and say everything is chance. No. The lesson is to recognize luck and risk as ever-present companions. Work hard, yes. Be disciplined, yes. But carry humility. Celebrate your wins, but also be grateful for the fortune that allowed them. Comfort yourself in your losses, knowing that risk spares no one. And above all, remember, success is never entirely earned, and failure is never entirely deserved. Lesson 3. Never enough. There is a story that Morgan Housel tells which has always stayed with me. It's about Rajat Gupta, a man who climbed from poverty in India to the very top of the corporate world. He became the head of McKinsey & Company, one of the most powerful consulting firms on earth. He sat on the boards of major corporations. He rubbed shoulders with billionaires and world leaders. By every conventional measure, he had made it. He was wealthy, respected, admired, but it wasn't enough. Gupta wanted more. He wanted the kind of wealth that could place him not just among the rich, but among the ultra-rich. And so, despite already having more money than he or his family could ever spend, he got involved in insider trading. He tried to grasp just a little more. That decision ended his career, destroyed his reputation, and landed him in prison. When I first read this story, I felt a chill, because it's easy to point at someone like Gupta and say, how foolish, how greedy. But if we are honest, most of us have felt the same temptation. That whisper that says, just a little more. Think about it. How many times have you thought, if I could just earn 10% more, I'd be comfortable? Then, when you get that raise, you quickly adjust, and suddenly, you want 10% more again. It's like chasing the horizon. No matter how far you walk, the horizon never gets closer. I remember a colleague who once confided in me that he was miserable at his job. He was making a 6-figure salary, far more than enough to cover his family's needs. But he felt trapped. If I leave, I'll never make this much again, he said. And we've gotten used to this lifestyle. He wasn't saving much because his expenses had risen to match his income. Vacations, luxury cars, private schools, all of it swallowed his paycheck. He couldn't imagine living on less. He had more than enough, yet he lived as though he were poor, because enough kept slipping further away. That's the trap of never enough. It robs us of contentment. It blinds us to what we already have. It pushes us into risks we don't need to take. The problem is that enough is invisible. We can see when someone has less than us. We can see when someone has more. But we rarely stop to define what enough actually means for ourselves. And so we drift, always comparing, always chasing, never satisfied. I think about professional athletes who earn tens of millions of dollars, yet still end up bankrupt. How does that happen? It happens because enough is never established. If one mansion is good, 2 must be better. If one sports car feels amazing, 10 must feel divine. If friends are flying private, then first class feels inadequate. The latter has no end. But here's the paradox. The ability to say enough is the true mark of wealth. Because once you can say, I have what I need, you free yourself from the endless cycle of comparison. You step off the treadmill and reclaim your peace. When I reflect on my own life, I see the tension clearly. There was a time when I thought happiness would come with a bigger house, a nicer car, a higher paycheck. And yes, those things felt good, for a while. But the satisfaction faded quickly, replaced by new desires. It wasn't until I started asking, what is truly enough for me, that I found clarity. For me, enough is the ability to cover my needs, save for the future, and have some freedom to enjoy life. I don't need endless more. This doesn't mean ambition is bad. Growth, progress, striving for excellence, these are beautiful parts of life. But ambition without boundaries becomes greed, and greed, unchecked, leads to ruin. There's another story that illustrates this point perfectly. It comes from a talk Housel shares, originally told by Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller, the author of Catch-22. They were at a party hosted by a billionaire. Vonnegut leaned over to Heller and said, "This billionaire makes more money in a single day than you made from your famous novel in your entire life." Heller replied, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. I have enough." That line is powerful. I have enough. It's easy to dismiss enough as settling, but in reality, it's liberation. It's the power to step away from the race, to stop comparing, to rest in contentment. And ironically, it's the very thing that many of the ultra-rich never find. So what does this mean for us? It means we need to define enough for ourselves, not in comparison to neighbors, colleagues, or strangers on social media, but in honest reflection about what truly matters. Enough might mean a modest home filled with love instead of a mansion filled with loneliness. Enough might mean time with your children instead of endless overtime for a slightly higher paycheck. Enough might mean peace of mind instead of the stress of constant competition. When we find our enough, we not only protect ourselves from unnecessary risks, we also discover joy. We begin to see what we already have as gifts, not as stepping stones to something bigger. For me, Lesson 3 is both a warning and an invitation. A warning against the endless chase that consumes so many, and an invitation to step back, breathe, and recognize the wealth already in our hands. Because in the end, the man who can say, "I have enough," may not have the most money, but he has something far more valuable: peace. Lesson 4. Confounding, compounding. Compounding is one of those ideas that seems almost too simple to be important. It's the kind of thing you learn in school, maybe in a math class, where the teacher explains that if you earn interest on your money, and then that interest earns interest, over time the growth becomes exponential. Students nod politely, scribble down a few formulas, and move on. It feels abstract, like something that belongs in a textbook rather than real life. But here's the secret. Compounding is not just a math trick. It is the closest thing we have to magic in the world of money. And the reason it works is not because it is complicated, but because it is relentless. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, is the perfect example. Everyone talks about his brilliance as an investor. They marvel at his instincts, his discipline, his strategies. But if you dig deeper, you realize his real secret weapon isn't just his skill. It's time. Buffett started investing as a child, when he was barely old enough to ride a bike. By the time he was a teenager, he was already experimenting with the stock market. Decades passed, and he simply kept going. Year after year, decade after decade, he invested, reinvested, and let compounding do its quiet work. Here's a mind-bending fact. More than 90% of Warren Buffett's net worth was accumulated after his 65th birthday. Think about that. He became a billionaire not just because he was smart, but because he gave compounding 70 years to run. That's the paradox of compounding. In the beginning, it feels slow, almost invisible. The gains are tiny. But as time passes, the curve bends upward, and suddenly the growth looks like magic. I remember when I first started saving money in my 20s. I opened an account, set aside a small amount every month, and waited. After a year, I checked the balance. It had grown, yes, but not by much. A few extra dollars, maybe enough for a nice dinner. Honestly, I felt disappointed. Was this really worth it? But I kept going. Year after year, the savings grew. Then something shifted. My savings started to generate returns, which in turn generated more returns. The numbers began to climb faster. Suddenly, the growth wasn't just from my contributions, but from the compounding itself. That was the moment I realized. Compounding is boring at first, but breathtaking later. It's like rolling a snowball down a hill. At the top, it's small and unimpressive. But as it gathers snow, as it keeps rolling, it becomes massive, unstoppable. That's the power of compounding. The challenge, of course, is that humans are not wired for patience. We live in a world of instant gratification. We want results now. We want fast growth, overnight success, immediate wealth. Compounding laughs at that mindset. It whispers, "Wait, be patient, give me time, and I will give you wonders." This is why so many people sabotage themselves. They start saving, investing, building, but when results don't come quickly, they quit. They pull their money out. They chase something else. And in doing so, they interrupt the very process that would have made them wealthy. There's a story about Grace Groner, a secretary who lived a modest, quiet life. She worked for Abbott Laboratories and bought a few shares of the company's stock in the 1930s. She never sold them. She held on to them for decades, reinvesting dividends, living simply. When she died in 2010, she left behind more than $7 million, money that went to charity. Grace wasn't a financial genius. She didn't chase trends or time the market. She simply gave compounding enough time to work. Contrast her with countless others who try to outsmart the market, jumping in and out, chasing quick gains. Many of them end up with far less. Why? Because compounding is not about brilliance, it's about endurance. When I think about compounding, I realize it applies far beyond money. Relationships compound. Knowledge compounds. Habits compound. If you invest a little effort in learning every day, in nurturing friendships, in building good habits, the rewards may seem small at first. But over years, even decades, they become extraordinary. The problem is, compounding hides its brilliance behind a veil of patience. Most people give up before the magic appears. They abandon the snowball before it gathers size. They uproot the tree before it bears fruit. For me, Lesson 4 is both inspiring and challenging. It inspires me to start small, to keep going, to trust the process even when results are invisible. But it also challenges me to fight against my own impatience, my own desire for quick wins. Because compounding doesn't reward speed, it rewards consistency. The key is not to look for fireworks, but for steady sparks. Not to chase the extraordinary, but to stick with the ordinary long enough for it to become extraordinary. So the next time you feel discouraged by slow progress, remember this: compounding is working in silence. You may not see it now, but given enough time, it will astonish you. And perhaps the greatest tragedy in finance is not the people who never learned about compounding, but the people who gave up on it too soon. Lesson 5. Getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. There's a saying that goes, "It's one thing to climb the mountain, but it's another to stay on top." The same applies to money. Making wealth and keeping wealth are two entirely different skills, and many people confuse the two. Getting wealthy often demands risk-taking, optimism, and even boldness that borders on recklessness. Staying wealthy requires almost the opposite: caution, humility, and the quiet discipline of survival. One is about offense, the other is about defense. Let's begin with a story. Jesse Livermore was one of the greatest stock traders of the early 20th century. During the crash of 1929, while millions of Americans lost everything, Livermore made a fortune by shorting the market. Overnight, he became one of the richest men in the world. Newspapers called him the Boy Plunger. His name was legendary on Wall Street, but within a few years, he had lost it all. How? Because the very qualities that helped him become rich, boldness, risk-taking, relentless ambition, were the same qualities that made him reckless. He couldn't switch gears from getting wealthy to staying wealthy. His story ended in tragedy. Livermore's rise and fall is a dramatic example, but the principle is universal. Many lottery winners burn through millions in a matter of years. Many professional athletes go bankrupt after retirement. Why? Because getting money is one skill, but keeping it requires a different mindset. Think about how most fortunes are made. Entrepreneurs risk their savings, their reputations, sometimes their sanity to build businesses. Investors bet boldly, sometimes against all odds. There's a level of fearlessness involved. You have to believe the improbable is possible. But once you've made it, survival becomes the key. Because if you keep swinging for the fences, if you keep doubling down, eventually risk will catch you. A single downturn can erase decades of progress. Morgan Housel puts it simply: getting money requires taking risks, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. But keeping money requires the opposite: humility, and the fear that what you've made can be taken away just as fast. I remember meeting a businessman who built a successful company from scratch. In the early years, he took huge risks, borrowing heavily, working long hours, betting on ideas that might have failed. Those risks paid off. His company grew, and he became wealthy. But then something changed. He realized that the very strategies that helped him build his fortune could also destroy it. So he shifted gears. He stopped taking reckless risks. He diversified his investments. He focused on protecting what he had. When the financial crisis of 2008 hit, many of his peers lost everything. He survived, not because he was luckier, but because he understood that getting wealthy and staying wealthy were not the same game. Staying wealthy is not about brilliance. It's about survival. It's about avoiding ruin. And to avoid ruin, you need 3 qualities. Frugality, living below your means so you always have a margin of safety. Paranoia, not in a crippling way, but in a way that keeps you cautious. Always asking, what could go wrong? Humility, the recognition that you're not invincible, that fortune can turn against you at any moment. When you have these qualities, you can endure. And endurance, more than brilliance, is what builds lasting wealth. I think of Warren Buffett again. Yes, he's famous for bold investments. But listen closely to his philosophy, and you'll hear constant references to risk and survival. He talks about the importance of never going broke, of always having cash on hand, of never betting the farm. He plays the long game, not the flashy one. Contrast that with countless traders who shoot for spectacular gains, only to implode when a single bad bet wipes them out. The market is littered with brilliant people who couldn't resist pushing too far. This lesson challenges me personally, because when things go well, it's tempting to think, I must be smarter than I thought. I should take more risks. I should double down. But that's when danger creeps in. The truth is, no matter how much we know, luck and risk are always at play. And if we don't respect them, we can lose everything. So I remind myself, survival first. Protect the downside. Don't gamble with what you need for the sake of chasing what you don't. In the end, wealth is less about making money quickly and more about keeping it consistently. Getting wealthy is flashy. Staying wealthy is boring. But boring is beautiful when it means lasting security. Because what good is winning the game if you can't stay in it? By the way, if you're enjoying this summary, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named Ronald Reed. He worked as a janitor in Vermont, driving a second-hand car and wearing inexpensive clothes. To anyone who saw him, he was ordinary, even poor. But when he died in 2014, the world was stunned. He left behind an estate worth $8 million. How? He had quietly invested and saved for decades, never showing off his wealth, never giving in to the urge to spend. His choices, which might have looked crazy to those who equate wealth with displays of luxury, made perfect sense to him. Now contrast that with someone like Richard Foscone, a former Merrill Lynch executive who lived in a 25,000 square foot mansion with 2 elevators, a home theater, and a wine cellar. He had visible wealth, the kind people admire from the outside. But when the 2008 crisis hit, he was wiped out. He declared bankruptcy. His choices, spending lavishly on lifestyle while taking on mountains of debt, seemed normal in his circle of wealthy peers. To him, it wasn't crazy, but in hindsight, it was catastrophic. Both men lived in the same era, in the same country. But their experiences, their mindsets, their lessons from the past shaped their actions. Neither was crazy. Each was acting in a way that felt rational to them. When I first read this lesson, I thought back to my own family. My grandparents saved everything, rarely spending on anything they didn't absolutely need. They grew up in a time when money was scarce, and every dollar mattered. To them, buying luxuries felt almost sinful. My parents, on the other hand, came of age in a more prosperous time. They weren't reckless, but they didn't carry the same fear. They believed in spending for comfort, for experiences, for joy. Watching the two generations sometimes clash over money, I realized neither was wrong. They were simply shaped by different worlds. This is why judging others' financial choices is dangerous. We assume we have the same reference point, but we don't. What looks reckless to us may feel cautious to someone else. What feels obvious to us may be unimaginable to them. And here's the twist. The same goes for us. The decisions we make today, which feel perfectly logical to us, may one day look foolish to someone else. A child or grandchild might look back and say, "Why did they waste so much money on smartphones?" Or, "Why didn't they buy more Bitcoin?" Or, "Why did they keep money in banks that paid almost no interest?" From their perspective, our rational choices might look crazy. So what's the lesson here? Humility. The humility to realize that we are all shaped by our experiences. The humility to accept that other people's choices, even when we don't understand them, make sense in their world. And the humility to admit that our own choices, as rational as they feel today, may look irrational tomorrow. When I think about my own financial journey, I try to remind myself of this lesson often. It stops me from being too harsh on others. It also keeps me from being too confident in myself. Because if no one is crazy, then everyone, including me, is just doing the best they can with the hand they've been dealt. And that perhaps is the most sane perspective of all. Lesson 6. Tails, you win. Life is not fair. That's a phrase we've all heard before, maybe even muttered under our breath when something went wrong. But in finance and investing, this unfairness takes on a unique shape. It's called the power law, the idea that a small number of events, a tiny minority, account for the majority of outcomes. In other words, most things don't matter very much. A few things matter enormously. Those few things, the rare, extraordinary tail events, end up shaping everything. Think about venture capitalists. They invest in dozens, sometimes hundreds of startups, fully expecting most of them to fail. 9 out of 10 will fizzle out, some quickly, some slowly. But that one success, the tail, might become the next Google, Amazon, or Facebook. That one outlier can pay for all the losses, and then some. Or consider history itself. The world was fundamentally changed by a handful of inventions: electricity, the internet, antibiotics, the airplane. There were countless other inventions along the way, but those tail events defined entire eras. The same principle applies to investing. Most stocks, over the long run, underperform, but a small fraction produce extraordinary returns. Missing out on those few can mean missing out on wealth entirely. I once knew a man who had invested in many companies over his lifetime. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that most of his investments had gone nowhere. Some had even gone to zero. But there was one, just one, that had exploded. That single company returned more than all his losses combined, leaving him ahead overall. "I wasn't a genius," he said with a shrug. "I was just around when lightning struck." That's the essence of tails. You don't need to be right all the time. You just need to survive long enough to catch a few big wins. But here's the problem. Tails are easy to underestimate. When we look back at success stories, we see them as inevitable. Of course, Apple became huge. Of course, Amazon dominated. Of course, the internet revolutionized everything. But at the time, none of it was obvious. Amazon, in its early years, was mocked as Amazon bomb. Apple, in the 1990s, was on the brink of collapse. The internet was once dismissed as a fad. It's only in hindsight that the tail events look inevitable. In reality, they were fragile, uncertain, and improbable. This is why humility is so important. If most outcomes are driven by a handful of unlikely events, then it's foolish to believe we can predict everything. What we can do is position ourselves to endure the many failures, so that when the rare success arrives, we're still standing to benefit from it. It reminds me of Thomas Edison's famous quote, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." He kept experimenting, kept enduring, until the tail event, the light bulb, finally worked. And that one success lit up the world. In my own life, I've seen the same principle play out, even outside of money. When I think back to the friendships, opportunities, and choices that shaped me most, it wasn't the dozens of casual acquaintances or the hundreds of routine days. It was a handful of pivotal moments: meeting a mentor, stumbling onto the right book at the right time, saying yes to a risky opportunity that ended up changing everything. Those were the tails, the outliers, that shaped my path. Money is no different. Most days in the market are unremarkable. Most investments are ordinary. But once in a while, something extraordinary happens. And if you're patient, if you stay in the game, those few moments can define your entire financial story. So what do we take from this lesson? First, don't despair at failure. Failure is part of the process. Most attempts won't pay off. That's not a flaw. It's the system. Second, don't expect to predict the tails. No one can. The people who benefit from them aren't necessarily the ones who saw them coming. They're the ones who stayed alive long enough to catch them. And third, respect the disproportionate power of rare events. Don't dismiss something just because it seems small or improbable. Today's unlikely long shot might be tomorrow's defining breakthrough. When I think about investing now, I remind myself, I don't need to be right all the time. I just need to avoid being wrong in ways that take me out of the game. As long as I stay in, as long as I endure, the tails will come eventually. And when they do, they'll make all the difference. In the world of money, as in life, tails win. And the ones who benefit are those who survive long enough to see them. Lesson 7. Freedom. At the heart of all the lessons in the psychology of money, there's one that feels more personal than the rest. It isn't about charts or numbers or strategies. It's about something deeper, something universal. Freedom. Because when you strip away all the layers, the salaries, the investments, the savings accounts, the possessions, money is ultimately about control. Control over your time, control over your choices, control over your life. Think about the last time you felt truly free. Maybe it was on a vacation, waking up without an alarm clock, deciding on a whim whether to explore the city or lie by the beach. Maybe it was a quiet Saturday morning, sipping coffee, no meetings to rush to, no deadlines looming over your head. In those moments, you tasted what freedom feels like. The ability to do what you want, when you want, on your own terms. Now imagine having that feeling, not just for a weekend or a holiday, but woven into the fabric of your everyday life. That is what money, when used wisely, can buy. Not luxury, not status, but freedom. I once worked with a man who was promoted to an executive role. The pay was incredible. The perks were dazzling. From the outside, he looked like the very picture of success. But when I congratulated him, his smile faltered. Honestly, he admitted, I'd trade half this salary just to see my kids more. He had money, but he had lost freedom. His calendar was crammed, his time was sold to meetings and flights and deadlines. The irony hit me hard. Money had trapped him instead of liberating him. This is a trap many fall into. We chase higher salaries, thinking they will make us happy. But often, the trade-off is that we lose control of our time. We exchange hours of our lives for money, then use that money to buy things we don't have time to enjoy. Morgan Housel writes that the highest dividend money pays is the ability to control your time. I love that phrase, the highest dividend, because it reframes money not as a pile of possessions, but as a ticket to freedom. I remember another story, this one about a woman named Christy Shen, who became known as one of the youngest retirees in Canada. She and her husband lived frugally, invested diligently, and by their early 30s had saved enough to quit their jobs and travel the world. People called them crazy, irresponsible, even selfish. But when asked why they did it, Shen replied simply, because time is more valuable than money. For them, wealth wasn't about a mansion or a luxury car. It was about the freedom to wake up and choose how to live their days. When I think about freedom, I realize it doesn't have to mean quitting your job or traveling endlessly. It might mean the freedom to say no to work you dislike, the freedom to take a day off without fear, the freedom to spend more time with loved ones, the freedom to pursue a passion project without worrying about whether it pays. Freedom scales differently for everyone. For some, it might mean retiring early. For others, it might mean simply not living paycheck to paycheck, not lying awake at night wondering how to cover bills. Whatever the form, the essence is the same. Freedom means money serves you, instead of you serving money. Of course, freedom requires choices, and choices require trade-offs. You may have to sacrifice some luxuries today to buy time tomorrow. You may have to resist the temptation of status to embrace the quiet satisfaction of independence. I once spoke with a friend who drove a modest car and lived in a small apartment, despite earning a solid income. When I asked why he didn't upgrade, he said, because every dollar I don't spend is a little more freedom I buy, and one day, that freedom will mean I can walk away from work if I want to. His answer struck me deeply. He wasn't denying himself pleasure. He was choosing a different kind of pleasure, the pleasure of freedom. This lesson challenges us to redefine what it means to be rich. Too often, we measure wealth by what people show: houses, cars, vacations. But real wealth, as Housel reminds us, is invisible, and the richest people are those who wake up each morning with control over their day. I think back to my grandparents. They didn't have much money by modern standards. They never owned a luxury car or a large house. But in retirement, they lived simply and happily. They had time for their garden, their grandchildren, their community. They weren't rich in dollars, but they were rich in freedom. And in many ways, that's the kind of wealth I aspire to. So, Lesson 7 leaves us with a powerful reminder. Don't chase money for money's sake. Don't fall into the trap of thinking luxury equals happiness. Instead, ask yourself, does this path, this decision, this expense bring me closer to freedom or further from it? Because at the end of the day, the greatest wealth is not measured in numbers, but in the hours of your life you truly control. Lesson 8. Man in the Car Paradox. Have you ever been walking down the street and suddenly turned your head when a sleek sports car zoomed by? Maybe it was a Lamborghini or a Ferrari or some other polished machine gleaming under the sun. For a moment, you felt a mix of awe and envy. You thought, wow, that car is amazing. But here's the paradox, and it's one of the cruelest jokes of money and status. When you admired that car, were you really admiring the driver? Or were you imagining yourself in the driver's seat? Most of the time, we don't actually care about the person behind the wheel. We don't say, that driver must be such a brilliant human being. We say, if only I had that car, people would admire me. In reality, though, everyone else is thinking the same thing. They're admiring the car, not the driver. That's the man in the car paradox. The very thing we buy to gain admiration rarely gets us the admiration we crave. I remember a neighbor from years ago. He bought a shiny new sports car, fire engine red, loud enough to wake the whole block when he started it in the morning. Every time he drove by, I could see the pride in his face. He thought we were impressed with him. And yes, people stared. But when they did, the conversations were always about the car. Did you see that model? That thing must cost a fortune. No one ever said, isn't he a remarkable man? And I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the engine is off, the car is parked, and the admiration disappears? Does the emptiness creep in? This paradox plays out everywhere. Someone buys a luxury watch thinking it will signal sophistication. Someone else renovates a massive kitchen not just for cooking, but for the admiration of guests. But here's the secret. People rarely notice in the way we hope. Or if they do, the admiration is shallow and fleeting. Real admiration is never about possessions. It's about character, about kindness, integrity, authenticity. Yet we often chase the illusion that money can buy respect. Morgan Housel shares that people want respect and admiration, and they think buying expensive things will bring it. But it almost never works that way. The admiration people feel is directed toward the object, not the person. This hit me personally when I bought my first brand new car. I'd always driven used cars before, but I decided I wanted something fresh, something shiny, something that made me feel successful. And for a while I loved it. Friends complimented it, strangers glanced at it. But then, gradually, the novelty faded. The car became just another car, and I realized no one cared as much as I thought they did. The respect I imagined I was buying never really existed. It's a humbling realization, because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. When we chase status through possessions, we're often projecting our own fantasies onto others. We imagine they see us the way we want to be seen, but in reality, they're lost in their own thoughts, their own desires, their own dreams of being in our place. So why do we fall for the paradox? Partly because advertising fuels it. Every luxury brand sells not just a product, but an image. Buy this, and people will admire you. But what they don't say is that admiration is fleeting, and often directed at the brand, not at you. I think about my grandfather again. He never owned a luxury car. He drove a modest sedan until it was nearly falling apart. Yet when he walked into a room, people respected him. Not because of what he drove, but because of who he was. His wisdom, his generosity, his integrity. That kind of respect can't be bought. It has to be earned. The lesson of the man in the car paradox is simple but profound. If you want people to admire you, focus less on what you own and more on who you are. Because the truth is, people rarely care about your possessions as much as you think they do. When you internalize this, you free yourself. Free from the endless chase of upgrades. Free from the stress of keeping up appearances. Free to spend your money on what truly brings you joy, not on what you hope will bring admiration. For me, Lesson 8 is a reality check. It reminds me not to mistake objects for respect, not to confuse possessions with love, not to believe the illusion that the world cares about my car, my clothes, my house. Because the people who matter, the ones whose respect is worth having, don't admire what you drive. They admire how you drive your life. Lesson 9. Wealth is what you don't see. When most people hear the word wealth, they imagine things they can see. Big houses with manicured lawns, shiny cars, designer clothes, exotic vacations. These are the visible signals of money. But here's the irony. True wealth is almost always invisible. Wealth isn't the car in the driveway. It's the car you could afford to buy but chose not to. It isn't the vacation photos on Instagram. It's the money quietly compounding in your account. Wealth is savings, investments, the financial cushion that gives you security. It's what you don't see. I remember a man in my town, someone everyone admired for his apparent success. He lived in a mansion, hosted extravagant parties, wore expensive suits. To outsiders, he seemed wealthy beyond measure. But years later, when the economy dipped, it was revealed that he was drowning in debt. The cars were leased. The house was mortgaged to the hilt. The parties were financed by credit cards. His wealth was a performance, a carefully constructed illusion. Then there was another man, quiet, unassuming. He drove an old pickup, wore worn-out jeans, lived in a modest home. People assumed he was just getting by. But when he passed away, his family discovered he had accumulated millions through decades of disciplined saving and investing. He never flaunted it, never sought to prove it. He had wealth, the invisible kind. This paradox fascinates me. We reward people for what we can see, but what truly matters is what we can't. A luxury car can signal wealth, but it might also signal debt. A modest lifestyle might suggest modest means, but it might also hide enormous financial security. That's why appearances are deceptive. They tell you nothing about what's really happening behind the curtain. I think back to my own younger years. There was a time when I equated wealth with status symbols. I believed that if I wore the right clothes, drove the right car, lived in the right neighborhood, I'd feel wealthy. And yes, for a short while I did feel that way. But the truth was, those things drained me more than they enriched me. The money spent on appearances was money I no longer had for savings, for investments, for freedom. It took me years to learn that wealth is not about impressing others. It's about securing yourself. There's a powerful quote I once heard. Wealth is the nice cars not purchased, the diamonds not bought, the clothes not worn out. It is the money quietly sitting in your bank account, silently giving you security and options. This flips the script. Real wealth is restraint. It's discipline. It's the ability to delay gratification, to say no to the fleeting applause of appearances in exchange for the lasting power of independence. One of the dangers of social media is that it magnifies appearances. Scroll through Instagram or TikTok, and you'll see endless displays of luxury, influencers showing off vacations, fashion, gadgets. But what you don't see is the credit card debt, the anxiety, the lack of savings. We live in a culture of spectacle, where the illusion of wealth is more celebrated than the reality of it. But illusions don't pay the bills. Illusions don't provide freedom. Only real, invisible wealth does. When I think of people who inspire me financially, they're rarely the ones flaunting riches. They're the ones who quietly live below their means, who save diligently, who invest patiently. They're the ones who understand that wealth isn't a show, it's a foundation. So the lesson is this. Stop measuring wealth by what you see. Stop comparing yourself to the neighbor's house or the coworker's vacation. Instead, ask yourself, how much freedom am I building? How much security? How many options do I have if life throws me a curveball? Because in the end, the true measure of wealth isn't the applause of strangers. It's the quiet confidence of knowing you're safe, stable, and free. Lesson 10. Save money. If there is one lesson in personal finance that sounds almost too simple to matter, it is this. Save money. People often roll their eyes when they hear it. Of course you should save, they say. That's obvious. But if it's so obvious, why do so many people fail to do it? The truth is, saving money isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about psychology. It's about discipline, priorities, and the quiet strength to resist the constant temptation to spend. I once had a friend who made a very comfortable income. He drove a nice car, wore tailored suits, lived in a house bigger than he needed. But when an emergency hit, a sudden health scare, he had nothing set aside. He scrambled, borrowing money, maxing out credit cards, panicking at every bill. He wasn't poor in income, but he was poor in savings. And that made all the difference. On the other hand, I've known people with modest salaries who lived comfortably because they saved diligently. They didn't chase luxury. They didn't try to impress. They built quiet reserves. And when emergencies came, they faced them with calm instead of fear. That's the power of saving. It doesn't just protect you financially. It protects your peace of mind. Morgan Housel writes that savings are not about what you earn, but what you keep. We live in a culture that glorifies income. The high-paying job, the big bonus, the six-figure salary. But none of that matters if it all flows out as fast as it flows in. What matters is the gap between what you earn and what you spend. That gap is savings. That gap is freedom. There's a story I often think of. During the 2008 financial crisis, many people lost their jobs. Some were devastated within weeks, unable to pay rent or buy groceries. Others, with even a few months of savings, had breathing room. They could take time to find new work, make better choices, avoid desperation. That breathing room is invaluable. It's the difference between being forced into bad decisions and being able to choose wisely. Here's the irony. Saving money is often dismissed as boring. There's no glamour in it. No bragging rights. Nobody posts on Instagram, "Look at my emergency fund." But behind the scenes, savings quietly transform lives. They buy flexibility. They buy resilience. They buy freedom. And unlike investments, which depend on the market, saving is entirely within your control. You don't need permission. You don't need predictions. You simply need discipline. I remember the first time I set a real savings goal. It wasn't huge, just 3 months of expenses. But when I finally reached it, the feeling was incredible. Not because of the number itself, but because of what it represented. Security. Suddenly, if something went wrong, I knew I wouldn't be ruined. That feeling of stability was more valuable than any gadget or luxury I could have bought with that money. There's another dimension to saving. It allows you to take risks. That may sound contradictory, but it's true. When you have savings, you have options. You can leave a toxic job. You can start a business. You can move cities, pursue a passion, or take time off. Without savings, you're trapped. Every paycheck is a leash. Every expense is a chain. This, to me, is the real beauty of saving. It isn't about hoarding. It isn't about denying yourself forever. It's about buying the most precious commodity of all, choice. Some people say they can't save because their expenses are too high. And yes, for some, that's true, especially in difficult circumstances. But for many, it's not about inability. It's about priorities. It's about believing that showing off wealth is more important than building it. I once saw a quote that stuck with me. Spending money to show people how much money you have is the fastest way to have less money. Saving flips that script. It says, I don't need to prove anything. I just want stability, peace, and freedom. For me, Lesson 10 is a reminder that saving money is not small. It is everything. It is the foundation upon which every other financial choice rests. Without savings, you're fragile. With savings, you're resilient. And the best part? Anyone can start. You don't need to be wealthy. You don't need to be brilliant. You just need to create a gap, however small, between what you earn and what you spend, and protect that gap fiercely. Because in the end, wealth isn't built by what you flaunt. It's built by what you quietly save. Lesson 11. Reasonable, rational. In theory, money is a matter of math. Add, subtract, multiply, compound. Rationally, you should always choose the path that maximizes returns and minimizes risk. But here's the problem. People are not calculators. We are not robots crunching probabilities. We are humans, full of emotions, fears, hopes, and contradictions. That's why in the real world, it's better to be reasonable than to be perfectly rational. Imagine 2 investors. The first is perfectly rational. He studies the data, analyzes every variable, and concludes that the best strategy is to put every dollar into high-return stocks, regardless of volatility. Mathematically, he's right. Over decades, he'll probably earn the highest returns. The second investor is not perfectly rational. She knows stocks are powerful, but also knows herself. She knows that if her portfolio drops 40% in a crash, she'll panic and sell. So instead, she diversifies. She keeps some money in bonds, some in cash. Her returns are lower on paper, but she sleeps better at night. Now ask yourself, who is better off? The one with higher theoretical returns but sleepless nights and potential panic? Or the one with slightly lower returns but peace of mind and consistency? The answer is clear. Reasonable beats rational. I learned this lesson the hard way. Early in my investing journey, I tried to be perfectly rational. I read books, ran calculations, optimized every detail. On paper, I had the smartest portfolio. But in reality, every dip in the market sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I checked my account daily, sometimes hourly. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. Eventually, I made panicked decisions that cost me more than if I had simply chosen a calmer, less optimal strategy from the start. Reasonable is sustainable. Rational, if it ignores emotions, is fragile. Morgan Housel emphasizes that people don't live in spreadsheets. They live in houses, neighborhoods, families, communities. They have children to care for, careers to balance, dreams to chase. And those realities often require compromises that don't look rational on paper, but make perfect sense in life. Here's another example. A friend of mine refuses to invest heavily in stocks. Rationally, he knows they tend to outperform over the long term. But he also knows himself. He grew up poor, watched his parents struggle, and carries a deep fear of losing everything. So he keeps a larger share of his money in cash. To outsiders, that might look foolish. To him, it's peace. And peace has value. It reminds me of a quote: "Your financial plan is only as good as your ability to stick with it." A plan that collapses the moment stress arrives is no plan at all. Better a reasonable plan you can live with than a rational one you can't. The same principle applies outside of money. Diets, for example. The rational diet might be the strictest, most efficient plan for weight loss. But if it's unbearable, if you hate every meal, you'll abandon it. A more reasonable diet, less perfect but more enjoyable, will last longer and ultimately succeed. In relationships, too, the rational partner might look perfect on paper, but real life is messy. Reasonable expectations, compromises, and forgiveness matter more than rigid logic. In money, the trap of rationality often comes from experts. Economists, analysts, financial advisors, they love rationality. They create models, predictions, and charts. And those models work in theory. But they rarely account for the messy, emotional reality of actual human behavior. The 2008 financial crisis was a perfect example. Models said the risks were manageable. Rationally, the system looked stable. But in reality, people panicked. Fear spread. Trust collapsed. And the models were useless because they didn't account for human emotion. For me, Lesson 11 is liberating. It gives permission to be human. It reminds me that I don't have to chase the mathematically perfect plan if it makes me miserable. I can choose a path that balances logic with comfort, numbers with feelings. And that doesn't make me weak. It makes me wise. So here's the takeaway. Don't aim to be perfectly rational with your money. Aim to be reasonable. Reasonable means sustainable. Reasonable means human. Reasonable means you'll actually stick with the plan long enough for it to work. Because in the long run, the best strategy isn't the smartest one on paper. It's the one you can live with for decades without giving up. Lesson 12. Surprise. If there's one thing history teaches us again and again, it is this. The future never unfolds exactly the way we expect it to. The biggest events, the ones that shape economies and societies, are almost always surprises. And yet, we still cling to the illusion that we can predict them. Think back to the early 20th century. In 1913, the world looked stable, peaceful even. Few people imagined that within a year, the First World War would erupt and alter the course of history. In 1928, the stock market was booming, prosperity seemed endless, and newspapers proclaimed a golden era. 1 year later came the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Fast forward to the 1970s. Oil flowed freely, and no one believed energy supplies could suddenly choke global economies. Then came the OPEC oil embargo, sending prices soaring and economies reeling. More recently, think about 2007. Financial experts praised mortgage-backed securities as safe and innovative. Banks were confident. Homeowners were optimistic. Within a year, the global financial system was on the brink of collapse. And who, honestly, predicted in 2019 that the following year a virus would lock down the entire planet, empty airports, close schools, and send shockwaves through every economy? Almost no one. The lesson here is sobering. Surprises are the norm. The most important events are by nature unpredictable. And yet, humans hate uncertainty. We crave forecasts, predictions, models. We want to believe that experts can see the future. But they can't, not really. I once attended a conference where an economist gave a detailed forecast of the next 10 years. Charts, graphs, probabilities. It was impressive. People scribbled notes, nodded thoughtfully. But I couldn't help thinking, how many forecasts from 10 years ago got the world we live in today correct? Almost none. And the reason is simple. The surprises are what matter most, and by definition, you can't forecast surprises. Morgan Housel argues that people underestimate how frequently the world changes in unpredictable ways. We anchor ourselves to what we know, forgetting how fragile the status quo really is. This is why humility is essential in finance. If surprises are inevitable, then arrogance is dangerous. Believing we can predict the future with certainty sets us up for disaster when the unexpected inevitably arrives. I saw this play out in my own circle. A friend of mine invested heavily in real estate, convinced that housing prices would only rise. He had charts, data, decades of history to back him up. And for years, it worked. Until the 2008 crisis blindsided him. Suddenly, his properties were worth far less, and he was underwater. His mistake wasn't in investing. It was in believing that the future would look exactly like the past. He left no room for surprise. The tricky part is that surprises can be both devastating and beneficial. Just as no one predicted the Great Depression, no one predicted the post-war boom that followed. Just as few foresaw the devastation of the pandemic, even fewer foresaw the resilience of markets that rebounded faster than expected. Surprises cut both ways. They bring risk, but they also bring opportunity. The challenge is to accept both without assuming we can perfectly predict either. So how do we live with this reality? By building resilience. By saving more than we think we need. By diversifying our investments. By avoiding overconfidence. By recognizing that our plans should bend, not break, when surprises come, because they will come. For me, Lesson 12 is a reminder to hold my financial plans loosely. To prepare, yes, but also to admit what I don't know. It's an invitation to trade arrogance for humility, to replace certainty with flexibility. Because in money, as in life, the only guarantee is that surprises are waiting. And the people who thrive are not those who predict perfectly, but those who adapt gracefully. Lesson 13. Room for error. If surprises are inevitable, and they are, then the only rational response is to give yourself room for error. Room for error is like oxygen. You don't notice it when you have plenty, but you notice its absence instantly when it runs out. Think about engineering. When an architect designs a bridge, the maximum weight it can support is not equal to the heaviest truck expected to cross. That would be reckless. Instead, the bridge is built with a margin, strong enough to hold several times that weight. Why? Because life is uncertain. Trucks can be heavier than expected. Storms can batter the structure. Accidents can happen. Without margin, disaster is guaranteed. The same principle applies to money. If every dollar you earn is spent, if every plan assumes perfect conditions, you have no margin. One job loss, one medical bill, one crisis, and your bridge collapses. I once knew a man who earned a high salary but spent all of it. He told himself, "I'll save later. For now, I'm fine." But when his company suddenly downsized, he had nothing set aside. His world fell apart overnight. He had no room for error. Contrast that with another friend of mine. She lived modestly, saved diligently, and kept her expenses well below her income. When she lost her job, she wasn't thrilled, of course, but she wasn't panicked either. She had months of savings, even a year's worth. She had time to search for the right opportunity instead of grabbing the first thing that came along. Her margin of safety gave her freedom. Room for error also applies to investing. The best investors don't assume they'll be right every time. In fact, they expect to be wrong often. They build portfolios that can survive mistakes. They diversify, keep cash on hand, avoid betting everything on a single outcome. Warren Buffett once said, "You only find out who is swimming naked when the tide goes out." In other words, when markets crash, those without margin are exposed. Those with margin, cash reserves, diversified investments, modest lifestyles, survive. This principle also explains why debt is so dangerous. Debt removes margin. It locks you into obligations that assume the future will go as planned. If it doesn't, if income drops, if interest rates rise, if emergencies strike, debt can turn a manageable problem into a catastrophe. I saw this clearly during the 2008 financial crisis. Families who had stretched themselves thin to buy large houses suddenly faced layoffs and falling home prices. With no margin, foreclosure came quickly. Others who had lived within their means, who had kept smaller mortgages or built savings, weathered the storm far more easily. What fascinates me is how ego often resists the idea of margin. People don't want to appear cautious. They want to appear bold, confident, in control. But margin isn't weakness. It's strength. It's the quiet strength of knowing you can take a hit and keep standing. It reminds me of pilots. Every flight plan includes contingencies, extra fuel, alternate airports, backup systems. No pilot says, "I'll plan for everything to go perfectly." That would be suicidal. Instead, they assume things will go wrong and prepare accordingly. Why should money be any different? In my own life, I've learned the value of margin through small moments. Times when an unexpected bill arrived, but I had savings to cover it. Times when I wanted to take a risk, like changing jobs, and could do so because I had a cushion. Each time I realized, margin isn't wasted money. It's purchased peace. Morgan Housel points out that survival is the most important financial skill. Not brilliance, not prediction. Survival. And survival requires margin. Without it, you're one shock away from ruin. With it, you're resilient. So lesson 13 is simple but profound. Build room for error. Save more than you think you need. Take less risk than you think you can handle. Assume the unexpected will come, because it will. And when it does, you won't just survive. You'll have the confidence to move forward while others scramble to recover. Lesson 14. You'll change. One of the greatest illusions in life is the belief that who we are today is who we'll always be. We convince ourselves that our current desires, our current goals, our current vision of the future are permanent. But time has a way of humbling us. Because the truth is, we change. We change more than we expect, and often in ways we can't foresee. Think back to who you were 10 years ago. What did you want? What did you believe? What did you dream of? Chances are, many of those dreams have shifted, if not disappeared entirely. Maybe you once longed for a certain career, but now you crave balance. Maybe you once valued possessions, but now you value experiences. Maybe you once thought you'd never leave your hometown, but now you dream of living abroad. The you of yesterday is not the you of today, and the you of today is not the you of tomorrow. This matters deeply when it comes to money, because so much of financial planning is about the future. We save, invest, and plan for decades ahead. But how do you plan for a future self whose desires you can't fully predict? Morgan Housel calls this the end of history illusion. People of all ages recognize they've changed a lot in the past, but they believe they won't change much in the future. A teenager knows they're not the same as when they were a child, but they think their current tastes will last forever. A 30-year-old sees how much they've grown since 20, but they assume their future self will be much like their present self. Yet time proves them wrong. I remember a colleague who worked tirelessly in his 20s and 30s, saving aggressively because his dream was early retirement and travel. He pictured himself globe-trotting, exploring new cultures, living out of a suitcase. And for a while, he did. But by his 40s, he discovered he didn't actually enjoy constant travel. What he really wanted was a quiet home near family with stability and routine. His savings weren't wasted. They gave him freedom. But his dream had shifted. His younger self would have been shocked. His older self was content. This happens in countless ways. Couples plan expensive retirements filled with luxury, only to realize later they prefer simple pleasures. Ambitious professionals chase wealth relentlessly, only to discover they'd rather have more time with their children. People sacrifice health for money, then spend money to recover health. Our values evolve, and with them, our definition of enough evolves too. So what do we do with this? If change is inevitable, does that make planning useless? Not at all. It just means we must plan with flexibility. Instead of carving our goals into stone, we should write them in sand, ready to adjust when tides shift. In practical terms, this means avoiding rigid commitments that lock us into one version of the future. It means saving broadly, not just for specific dreams, but for the unknown dreams our future selves will have. It means embracing options, the ability to pivot when desires change. I once heard someone say, "The best reason to save is to buy yourself options." That resonated deeply with me, because saving isn't just about preparing for what you want now. It's about preparing for the day when you want something different. Options are a gift to your future self, the self you don't yet know, but who will one day thank you. This lesson also teaches humility. How often do we criticize others for changing their mind? We call it inconsistency, weakness. But isn't change a natural part of growth? Why should our financial lives be any different? It takes courage to admit that what we once wanted is no longer what we want. It takes wisdom to adjust course. In my own life, I see this clearly. When I was younger, I thought success meant working in prestigious jobs, climbing ladders, earning titles. Later, I realized those things mattered less to me than freedom, time, and meaningful work. If I had planned only for the dreams of my younger self, I'd be trapped now. Thankfully, by keeping flexibility, I can adjust. So, Lesson 14 is both a warning and a comfort. A warning that our future selves may look back and laugh at our current plans. And a comfort that it's okay. Change is not failure. Change is growth. In money, as in life, the goal isn't to predict perfectly. It's to prepare wisely. Prepare for the person you are today, but also for the person you haven't yet become, because you will change. And the best gift you can give your future self is the freedom to embrace it. Lesson 15. Nothing's free. Everywhere we look in life, there is a hidden price tag. Sometimes it's obvious, printed clearly in numbers. Other times it's invisible, disguised as stress, uncertainty, or risk. But one truth never changes. Nothing in life, and certainly nothing in finance, is free. Take investing. At first glance, it looks simple. Put your money into the stock market, wait patiently, and over decades you'll likely earn a handsome return. Easy, right? But what's the price? The price is volatility. Watching your portfolio swing wildly up and down, sometimes dropping 30 or 40% in a matter of months. That roller coaster of emotion is the bill you pay for long-term gains. Too many people want the returns without the price. They want to ride the elevator up, but not down. So when the market falls, they panic, sell low, and lock in losses. They refuse to pay the price of volatility, but without paying it, they'll never reap the rewards of compounding growth. History is filled with reminders of this. During the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, people poured money into internet stocks, believing they'd all go up forever. When the bubble burst, panic set in, and many swore off investing altogether. But those who endured the pain, who paid the price of volatility, eventually saw enormous gains in the years that followed. The lesson? The cost of market returns is not dollars or fees. It's stomach-churning uncertainty, and you can't escape it. You can only decide whether or not to pay it. But the principle of nothing's free goes far beyond markets. Education, for example. A degree might open doors, but the price is years of effort. Late nights, tuition bills, and opportunity costs. Health is another. Exercise rewards us with strength and longevity, but the price is sweat, discipline, and sometimes discomfort. Relationships, too. Love brings joy, but the price is vulnerability, compromise, patience. Everything has a cost. The question is not whether you'll pay, but whether the reward is worth the price. I once knew someone who dreamed of starting their own business. They talked about it for years, the freedom, the potential wealth. But when faced with the reality, long hours, uncertainty, the risk of failure, they backed away. They wanted the reward without the price. And so, the dream remained just that, a dream. On the other hand, I knew a couple who opened a small bakery. They worked before dawn, rolling dough, serving customers, managing bills. It was exhausting. But they accepted the price. And over time, their bakery became a local treasure, sustaining them both financially and emotionally. They understood that success demanded payment, not just in money, but in sweat and perseverance. This lesson hit me personally when I began investing seriously. At first, I saw every loss as a mistake, every downturn as failure. I thought the goal was to avoid pain entirely. But then I realized, losses are not mistakes. They are tuition. They are the price of admission to the game of investing. And once I reframed them that way, they felt less frightening. Morgan Housel puts it well. The volatility, the fear, the doubt, these are not punishments. They are the price of success. This truth applies even to freedom itself. Remember Lesson 7? Freedom is the highest dividend money can pay. But freedom isn't free. The price is often restraint, saying no to luxuries, saving diligently, delaying gratification. The freedom to control your time tomorrow comes at the cost of discipline today. So how should we live with this lesson? First, by recognizing that costs are inevitable. There is no shortcut, no free lunch. Second, by choosing our costs wisely. Not every price is worth paying. Chasing status, for example, costs money, time, and peace, but rarely brings lasting joy. But paying the price of patience, discipline, and saving almost always brings rewards. For me, Lesson 15 is about shifting perspective. Instead of asking, how can I avoid all pain? I now ask, am I willing to pay this price for the outcome I want? That mindset turns fear into choice. It gives me agency. Because when you accept the price up front, the struggle feels purposeful instead of punishing. So let this be the reminder. Nothing is free. Not wealth, not health, not love, not freedom. But when you choose the right prices to pay, the rewards far outweigh the costs. By the way, if you're enjoying this summary, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Lesson 16, You and Me. On the surface, money looks objective. Numbers, interest rates, charts, percentages, all cold and logical. But underneath, money is deeply personal. Because the way you see money is shaped by your life, and the way I see money is shaped by mine. And the games we're playing with money are not always the same. Imagine two people standing in front of the same stock chart. The first is a 23-year-old day trader, hoping to double his money in a few weeks. The second is a 65-year-old retiree, relying on that same stock for dividends to cover groceries. They're both watching the same graph, but they're playing completely different games. If the stock price dips, the young trader may panic or gamble, because for him, short-term swings matter. The retiree may ignore it, focusing on the long-term payouts. Or perhaps the retiree panics, while the trader sees opportunity. Either way, the crucial point is this. The same data means different things depending on the game you're playing. I once sat in on a heated conversation between two investors. One argued that holding cash was foolish, because inflation would erode its value. The other argued that cash was essential, because it provided flexibility and safety. They debated fiercely, each convinced the other was wrong. But later I realized, they weren't even playing the same game. The first was young, chasing growth. The second was older, preserving security. Both were right for their game. Both were wrong for the others. This happens all the time. We see someone buy cryptocurrency and think they're reckless. Or we see someone refuse to invest in stocks and think they're timid. But in truth, they may simply be playing different games. One is seeking quick upside. The other is seeking stability. Judging them by our own rules misses the point. Morgan Housel emphasizes this. When you see financial behavior that looks odd, remember that the person may be responding rationally to their own set of goals, risks, and time horizons. What's reckless for you may be reasonable for them. The danger comes when we confuse games, when short-term traders influence long-term investors, when long-term investors shame short-term gamblers, when advice meant for one audience gets applied to another. Think about financial media. Headlines scream, "The market is crashing," or "Stocks are overvalued." But are they speaking to day traders, long-term investors, retirees, young savers? Often they don't clarify, and so we absorb fear or excitement that doesn't even apply to the game we're playing. This lesson hit me personally when I compared myself to friends. Some were buying big houses, upgrading cars, living lifestyles that seemed out of reach for me. I felt behind, like I was failing. But then I realized they were playing a different game. Some valued status, some valued comfort, some took on debt I wasn't willing to risk. My game was different, saving for flexibility, prioritizing freedom over appearance. And once I saw that, the comparison lost its sting. I think of it like sports. Imagine a soccer player criticizing a marathon runner for not scoring goals, or a marathon runner mocking a soccer player for getting tired after 90 minutes. The criticism makes no sense because they're playing different games. Money works the same way. So what do we do with this? First, clarity. Be crystal clear about the game you're playing. Are you saving for retirement in 30 years? Are you trading for short-term profit? Are you preserving wealth for your children? Once you know your game, you can filter out the noise that doesn't apply. Second, humility. Don't assume others are wrong just because they're playing differently. Don't copy strategies blindly without asking whether they fit your goals. Third, discipline. Stick to your game, even when others tempt you with theirs. Because the quickest way to lose is to switch games midstream without realizing it. For me, Lesson 16 is the reminder to focus inward, to stop comparing, stop judging, stop assuming that what works for someone else must work for me. It's an invitation to know my own goals, my own risks, my own values, and to live by them unapologetically. Because in the end, money isn't one game. It's billions of different games, played by billions of people. And the only scorecard that matters is the one that belongs to you. Lesson 17. The seduction of pessimism. Optimism often sounds like naive cheerleading. Pessimism, on the other hand, sounds smart, serious, even sophisticated. Tell someone the world is about to collapse, and you'll get their attention. Tell them everything will be fine, and you'll be dismissed as unrealistic. That's the strange seduction of pessimism. It feels safer, wiser, more intellectual. Consider the financial news. Headlines rarely say, "Markets continue steady climb." Instead, they scream, "Crash coming," "Recession ahead," "Investors panic." Why? Because fear grabs eyeballs. Fear makes us click. Fear sells. But look at history. Despite countless crises, wars, recessions, and disasters, the long-term trend of the global economy is upward. Progress happens. Innovation continues. Standards of living improve. The optimists, mocked in the short term, usually win in the long term. Think about the 2008 financial crisis. In those dark months, pessimism dominated. Pundits predicted another Great Depression. Some said capitalism itself was finished. And yet, within a few years, markets recovered, companies rebuilt, and the world moved forward. Or consider the pandemic in 2020. At the height of the lockdowns, fear was everywhere. Some said markets would collapse for decades. But by the end of that same year, the stock market had rebounded dramatically. The pessimists looked clever in March. The optimists looked wise by December. Why does pessimism seduce us so easily? Because losses hurt more than gains feel good. Psychologists call this loss aversion. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good. And so we're wired to pay more attention to threats than to opportunities. I've felt this myself. When markets dip, my heart races. I imagine worst-case scenarios. But when markets rise, I barely notice. Fear demands attention. Hope whispers quietly. There's also something flattering about pessimism. When someone warns of doom, we think, they must know something I don't. They must be clever, insightful. Optimists, by contrast, seem simplistic. Don't worry, it'll all work out. Yet history shows us that, in the long run, the optimists are usually right. Morgan Housel notes that pessimists sound like they're trying to help you, to protect you from risk. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. But progress is the natural state of the world. The default outcome of human creativity, resilience, and problem-solving is growth. I remember talking to an older investor who had lived through multiple recessions. He told me, every time the world looked like it was ending, it wasn't. We always found a way forward. People innovate. People rebuild. People don't just give up. His calm optimism wasn't flashy, but it was grounded in decades of experience. This doesn't mean optimism ignores risk. Crises are real. Losses are painful. Recessions hurt. But optimism says, despite the pain, we recover. Despite the setbacks, we move forward. Despite the darkness, there is light ahead. So how do we apply this lesson? First, be cautious in the short term, but optimistic in the long term. Expect volatility, downturns, even crises, but trust that over decades, progress will prevail. Second, be skeptical of constant doomsayers. They may sound smart, but their track record is poor. Third, cultivate hope. Not blind hope, but grounded hope. The kind that sees setbacks as temporary, not permanent. For me, Lesson 17 is a reminder to balance realism with optimism, to respect risks, but not be paralyzed by them, to listen to warnings, but not let them drown out the steady hum of progress. Because in the end, pessimism may seduce us, but optimism builds the future. Lesson 18. When you'll believe anything. Money doesn't just shape our decisions. It shapes the stories we tell ourselves. And when emotions run high, especially during booms and busts, people will believe almost anything if it helps them make sense of what's happening, or if it justifies what they desperately want to be true. Think about bubbles. During the housing bubble of the mid-2000s, people convinced themselves that home prices could only ever go up. They told stories like, they're not making any more land, or everyone needs a house, so it's a safe investment. Banks told stories too. These mortgage-backed securities are safe because they're diversified. The stories made people feel comfortable, but they weren't true. And when reality struck, the entire system collapsed. The same thing happened during the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s. Investors believed that every internet company would become the next Amazon. Profits didn't matter, only growth. Eyeballs on a website were valued as highly as actual earnings. It was a story, and people believed it, until the bubble burst and billions of dollars vanished. Why do we fall for these stories? Because money is emotional. When prices are rising, greed whispers, don't miss out. When prices are falling, fear screams, get out before it's too late. To justify our actions, we spin narratives. We convince ourselves that this time is different, that the rules have changed, that our decisions are rational. Psychologists call this narrative fallacy, the human tendency to create stories that make sense of chaos. We crave order, meaning, logic, even if we have to invent it. And when money is involved, those stories become seductive. I've seen this even among friends. One invested heavily in cryptocurrency during the boom. He explained confidently, "This isn't speculation. This is the future of money. Prices will only go higher as adoption spreads." It wasn't just analysis. It was faith. When the crash came, he lost much of his investment. Later, he admitted, "I think I believed what I wanted to believe. And haven't we all?" When the market treats us kindly, we tell ourselves it's because we're smart. When it treats us poorly, we tell ourselves it's because the system is rigged. Rarely do we admit the role of luck, chance, or our own blind spots. Morgan Housel notes that the most dangerous stories are the ones we tell ourselves. It's easy to dismiss someone else's foolish belief, but when we invent our own, we defend it fiercely. We wrap it in logic, clothe it in statistics, polish it with confidence. And the more money is at stake, the harder it becomes to admit we might be wrong. This is why skepticism is so valuable. Not cynicism, not dismissing everything, but healthy skepticism. Asking, Am I believing this because it's true or because I want it to be true? Am I following data or following desire? I try to practice this myself. Before making a big financial decision, I pause and ask, what story am I telling myself right now? Am I imagining a future that may never come? Am I ignoring risks because I want to believe in rewards? It doesn't always stop me from mistakes, but it slows me down enough to think. This lesson also applies outside of money. In relationships, people tell themselves stories. He'll change, or she really loves me deep down, sometimes ignoring obvious red flags. In careers, we say, if I just keep working harder, everything will fall into place, even when the job is draining us. Stories are how humans make sense of the world, but sometimes they trap us. For me, Lesson 18 is a humbling reminder. I'm not immune to self-deception. None of us are. The mind is a brilliant storyteller, and money is the perfect stage for its dramas. Recognizing this doesn't make me invincible, but it makes me more cautious, more reflective. So what's the takeaway? Be careful with the stories you believe, especially the ones you tell yourself. Ask hard questions. Test your assumptions. Accept that the truth may be less exciting, less comforting, but far more reliable. Because in money, as in life, the cost of believing the wrong story can be devastating. Lesson 19. All together now. We've traveled through 18 lessons, stories of luck and risk, of patience and greed, of freedom and restraint, of optimism and fear. Each lesson has stood on its own, but together they form something larger, a philosophy of money. Morgan Housel calls this last chapter All Together Now, because it ties the threads into a single truth. Doing well with money isn't about brilliance, formulas, or insider knowledge. It's about behavior, about humility, about survival, about understanding yourself. Let's bring the ideas back together. No one is crazy. We all act from the lens of our own experiences. What seems foolish to you may be reasonable to me, depending on the paths we've walked. Luck and risk are everywhere. Success is never fully earned, and failure is never fully deserved. Fortune and tragedy dance invisibly alongside effort and talent. Enough is the antidote to greed. Without it, we chase endlessly, never satisfied. With it, we find peace. Compounding is the quiet miracle. Its magic isn't in brilliance, but in endurance. Time is its ally, impatience its enemy. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are different games. The first demands boldness. The second requires caution. To mistake one for the other is to invite ruin. Tails drive outcomes. A handful of rare events shape everything. Survival matters more than perfection. Freedom is the ultimate dividend. Not possessions, not applause, but control over your own time. And appearances deceive. Wealth isn't what you flaunt. It's what you keep hidden. Savings, security, independence. Reasonable beats rational. Plans that account for human emotions are stronger than those that ignore them. Surprises will come. The future will not unfold the way you expect. Room for error is your only shield. You'll change. Your future self will want different things than your present self. Flexibility is more valuable than certainty. Nothing is free. Every reward demands a price, whether in volatility, patience, sacrifice, or discipline. And remember, we're all playing different games. Respect that. Don't confuse someone else's strategy for your own. Pessimism will seduce you, but optimism will build the future. Stories will tempt you, but truth will protect you. When you put it all together, the message is clear. The psychology of money is about mastering yourself more than mastering markets. It's about endurance more than intelligence, humility more than pride, flexibility more than rigidity. It's not about getting rich quick. It's about staying rich slowly. As we close this journey, I want you to step back and imagine money not as an end, but as a tool for freedom, a tool for peace, a tool for shaping a life that matters. Too often, we treat money as a scoreboard. We compare, we compete, we chase. But the real question isn't, how much do I have compared to others? The real question is, does my money give me the life I want? Does it give me freedom? Does it align with who I am and who I want to become? I think back to the stories in these lessons. Janitors who quietly built millions, executives who lost everything, investors who survived, and families who endured. The patterns are clear. Those who thrive are not the smartest, but the most humble. Not the boldest, but the most patient. Not the richest in possessions, but the richest in options. For me, reading The Psychology of Money was less like reading a finance book and more like holding up a mirror. I saw my own fears, my own mistakes, my own temptations staring back at me. And I also saw hope. Hope that by shifting my perspective, I could use money not as a chain, but as a key. The key to security. The key to freedom. The key to living a life that feels truly mine. So as you walk away from these 19 lessons, remember this. Money isn't about numbers. It's about behavior. And behavior can be learned, practiced, improved. You don't need to be a genius. You don't need to predict the future. You just need humility, patience, and the wisdom to know what really matters. Because in the end, the greatest wealth isn't found in your bank account. It's found in the freedom to wake up each morning and say, "Today, I get to choose." If you found value in this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who needs this wisdom.